Welcome to the Green Jobs Media Series, where we explore the intersection of climate justice, urban sustainability, land regeneration, and circularity. I'm your host, Jose Reyeros, and today we have the pleasure to chat with George Benson. George is an urban planner and economic developer. Right now, he is managing the economic development and market transformation programs at the Zero Emissions Innovation Center. George, welcome.
Thanks so much for having me. Really appreciate it.
I want to start today with some Solarpunk. Tell me, what do you see in your render of AI futurisms happening?
One of the things I love about Solarpunk is that it's always this pastiche. It brings things together that aren't always obvious for people. And so Solarpunk, building on the tradition of cyberpunk, is like asking questions about how do we bring technology and nature together. And I'm pretty open-minded for seeing how different elements of technology, whether that's something that's really obviously AI or just big human thinking and engineering intersecting with nature. We're in Vancouver here, community gardens here. Vancouver is doing a lot of really interesting work to bring rainwater gardens and bioswales and other natural rainwater systems into the city itself. And it's that intersection. I think even those in the real world today are a little bit solarpunky. But for me, it's just anything that brings together the human and nature in ways that are positive and generative. Anything like that gets me excited in terms of solarpunk.
Totally. I always find that this AI support just helps us take that first step, and then it's still missing it, but so much of the human creativity just comes after. And for me, it's like we're talking about this, just finding that first plot, because it's such a wait time. And I look forward to growing some zucchinis one day, and
can't wait.
I'll invite you to the first batch of zucchini cupcakes. So George, tons of people told me to talk to you, and the first time I saw a picture of you, there was no long hair or beard. So that's a lot of experience, I would imagine. I would like to hear a bit more about Vancouver Economic Commission and the Zero Emissions Innovation Center, particularly as we talk more about BIPOC youth and how they face more unique challenges when entering this workforce. Maybe you can speak a little bit more about what the state of labor for those sectors are and what that means for young BIPOC climate professionals.
No, it's a great question. I think I'm really happy to be in a moment in time where the environmental movement, sort of more specifically, and I think our world more generally, are asking really important questions about social equity, racial justice, LGBTQ plus inclusion. It's the moment is really now, right? And I think in the sort of green world in particular, there is a recognition that historically the environmental movement has been very white. It's spoken to the priorities of a lot of very, very well-meaning people, but who come from a pretty homogenous background. And I think the movement, in terms of the nonprofits and the activist groups, they're all asking questions about, particularly in a place like Canada, where we're here on Indigenous territory, what are the roles, or what are the roles for those organizations, and what are the ways that they can actually carry forward a responsibility not only to the land, but the people who have stewarded it since time immemorial. And in the sort of the workplace, that conversation is very alive as well, right? I think about the growth of a lot of engineering jobs, I would say, are where many newcomer Canadians, often coming from diverse backgrounds, non-white backgrounds, I'm seeing a ton of new entrants in those sectors, which is amazing. And at the same time, I see them still facing a lot of challenges. There's the very obvious sort of structural ones, like the just recognition of credentials coming from different universities, different educational backgrounds, and then there's those more insidious ones where it's questions of what does a professional look like. The classic example is African American folks wearing their hair more naturally. Is that professional? Is it unprofessional? Right? And those kinds of struggles, I know from my friends who have those kinds of identities, are very painful. Lots of people are struggling to try to just be themselves in their workplaces. And I think a lot of workplaces are grappling and saying, how do we step up and be better? But I think I still see a lot of folks on the individual side saying, this isn't good enough, we're not there yet. So say, the summation is, it's a moment of change. There's a lot happening. There's a lot of really important work being led by a lot of BIPOC folks in particular, but I think many people of diverse backgrounds. And yet we've got a long way to go. I don't know if that's a fair summation, but that's a lot of how I see that space.
Right now, do you consider there's a fair representation in terms of diversity in leadership positions?
No, not in the slightest. I think the work of organizations like Diversity and Sustainability, for example, they have highlighted again and again and again and again the maleness, the whiteness, the straightness of the people that are running many of the organizations around the world. And even here, I think places like Vancouver and Canada writ large tend to score a little bit better. We tend to be a little bit more diverse than, in certain cases, our American colleagues or other places around the world, certainly sort of white settler countries. But there's still a huge gap that's unrepresentative of the places we live, the people we represent between these organizations, and we're in the important and often painful journey to sort of find that balance.
Totally, yeah. And, right now I think the way that we interact with this more systemic forces and how do we find ourselves in this economy and in this perhaps more of the organizing scene, positionality comes often as a defining characteristic to not only who we are, but what are we going to do with who we are. And I often find that the conversation sometimes talks about, where are you indigenous to? And that, break between what are your roots and what do you do with who you are, sort of limits a lot of people. For example, I'm going to talk from my perspective, but, I'm an immigrant and I do feel like in some senses I might be racialized in some of the spaces for professional development or in my academic career and whatnot. But I'm very privileged just to be here. And, I cannot even imagine what that can be for someone that will come from a more marginalized and vulnerable place. But I want to talk from that nuance on how have you experienced leveraging who you are, your positionality, in dealing with people from other generations, especially in leadership, especially as you try to disrupt these places and spaces that work in a certain way, upholding a status quo that no longer works.
Yeah, that's well said. One of the principles of environmental work really is honesty. It's a recognition of the material reality of the world we live in, the impact we have on the planet, and saying we're not going to pretend that this isn't happening. We need to acknowledge it. We need to be truthful. We need to be curious and understand how our impact in the world is being felt and how we can make it better. I think it's beholden upon folks in those roles, folks like myself, to then carry that over into questions of personal identity as well. What is our societal impact, and then how do we show up as a society, and how do we show up as individuals? I feel lucky as a white man in the world. I recognize how much privilege I carry, and also as someone who has ADHD, who comes from a working class background, the understanding all of the nuances of my own identity for myself is a really important part into stepping into the work of equity and reconciliation. It's also, I think, an important part of just stepping into environmental work. It's about being honest. It's about understanding the full context of things. That includes your identity. So for myself, I think as I've been on a journey of understanding how I'm perceived in the world, what privileges come with the way I look and sound, my education, I have felt a really distinct call to leverage the privileges that I have in service of the causes and the people that I want to serve. And so, I often talk about being a white guy in a suit enables me to go into certain rooms that are not comfortable, in some cases not safe, for folks who are on the same team as me. We're trying to achieve the same objectives. And my role, I think, in many ways is probably twofold. One is to say the things that I've been told by the people that can't get in that room, to be a messenger, and then also to try to create space in that room so that those folks can come along with me next time. And it's a slow process. It's not something that happens overnight, but the work of it is to acknowledge where we sit, to say, what are the complexities of how I show up in the world? How can I advocate for the communities I do represent and the ones that are, beside me, adjacent to me, that I'm allied with, and then bring that forward. And so being able to step into those rooms has been a really great privilege. And I've been able to do that, for example, on the Climate Solutions Council. I was named as a ministerial advisor in 2022, and I was able to, I hope, do a good job of speaking for youth across British Columbia in holding our government to account and advising our Minister of the Environment. Those are the kinds of roles that are really important to think seriously about in your positionality and what you want to leverage for that.
Definitely. I really enjoy that answer, particularly because, you look at people who are in those councils and those leadership positions, and as a young person, you think, okay, how do I get there? And, the answer lies within something happening in 10 years. And, I know that you cannot really cut corners, but I have noticed that from mentors and people talking to me about their advice, you need to learn how to settle with where you are now and navigate your radical ideas and disruption and seeing how do you talk the language of the current system. So I think that right now, as I explore graduation, I know of other organizer activists and young people looking to get involved with this dream climate job we all think about. That maybe we have to give up on some of those ideals, and maybe we have to explore how do we adapt to these new spaces. So how have you taken forward progressive ideas to stakeholder audiences and to bosses in the past or politicians that can make a huge difference, but we're not sure if they're actually getting the message?
I love this question, and I think I'll disagree with one part of it, though, which I think is very important. I don't think it's the case that we need to give up on our ideas. I think we need to hold our ideals and our values really strongly, and we need to be open and creative with the ways that we realize those values. So if we believe in a world of getting to net zero by 2050, there are many, many paths to get there. There are a billion more dead ends, routes we just absolutely should not take, but there are many ways to get there. And what we need to ask is what are the values we have, and what kind of solutions does that constrain us to in getting to that goal? So we may say that giving time and space for fossil fuel communities to transition off of the resource they depend on for their economy, we want that space and time. Okay, if that's important to us, then we need to be able to answer the question, how do we get to the carbon objectives that we're looking for? And how do we do so fairly, with an eye towards the imbalances between the global north and global south, like all of those things? We need to chart pathways that are specific to our values. But if we get really fixated on, there really is only one solution, and it's X, then that's when we're gonna be, I think, really disappointed. But if we're saying, again, these are my values, and if we're working together, these are the values we share, and maybe we disagree on a couple things here and there, but if we've got a core set that we agree on, then we can map ways to get to where we want to go that are effective. So in my career, I would say have had plenty of scraped knees and bumps along the way in terms of pushing those ideas, but I've always remained really rooted in, as an economic developer, for example, I want to work with both businesses and workers. It's not the case that just a bunch of startups are going to save us from climate change. There are new technologies and new ideas that are great, and we need to support those folks. But a really core aspect of the transition for me is that everyday working people are going to have a better life, economically, environmentally, on the other side of this transition. And so the ways in which we do that are super varied. I've had the privilege to support worker-owned cooperatives doing really interesting stuff. I have supported startups that are really pursuing a very traditional kind of technological tech sector growth trajectory. All of those are valid, but it's the stack of them to get where we want to go. The values that I have always kind of guided that stack of things, and that's been really, I think, instructive for me in moving the ball forward. Because you ask about bosses and stuff, like folks of older generations, many of them are just beginning to grapple, to be honest, with the scale of the transition we're talking about. It's not just a little bit more electricity. It's not just a bit of carbon capture. It's a huge societal transformation. And so to say to them, these are the goals, this is where we're trying to get, let's talk creatively about the solutions, I found a lot more openness to that than, no, the only answer is if we do X.
Totally, yeah. And I've definitely felt that sort of sense of pragmatism develop more when, you go more into this economically relevant or public spaces where you become participant in maybe a consultation for a city. And with difference of organizing or academic spaces, you begin to not see a lot of the wording that you would always see. Like, I mean, it took me a few months, but I had to take every single radical out of my resume because I was not getting anywhere. But you begin to see that that word translates into something different, and that it gains context, and that really is what keeps the ideal consistent, right? Thank you for that. I really enjoyed hearing that. I think that moving on, I want to talk a bit more about perhaps how we build our careers. And I really enjoy how you mentioned the collective efforts and how everyone is doing their own part in their own way. But something I've noticed in community organizing is that collective idea and becoming idealist to that and truly trying to stay real to it. We are so individualized right now as a society, but sometimes I feel like it takes us a little bit too much effort to know our worth and to not only on a level of how much am I getting paid, but how much time am I going to spend for my own well-being. And with that, I want to talk about work as well-being. And specifically, how have you navigated maintaining your career path to go where it needs to go, balancing it with the greater good and the impact that you want to keep seeing in the things that you do every day?
I mean, it's interesting that in the ecological crisis that we find ourselves in, we are faced with the question of balance in our ecosphere and how we use resources and energy flows and everything. And that crisis and question extends all the way down to the individual too. How do we balance the work that we do every day with the time that we need for ourselves to rejuvenate, to be creative, to be loving, to be family, to be relational, all of those things. And the uncomfortable answer is that it's hard. It isn't easy to find balance in those things. And if I'm honest, I've spent a lot of my career being very unbalanced in the way that I've done things. From the vantage point of now being in my early 30s and having kind of ridden through the ups and downs of different parts of that, I feel much more balanced than I did when I was, in my early 20s, where I had a million volunteer commitments. I was doing a lot of paid work at the same time. Like I was really juggling too many balls, and I burnt myself out.
You feel invincible,
totally,
early 20s,
right? I don't need to sleep that much. I'll eat later. It's all fine, and it does take its toll. But today, from my vantage point, what I do, there's a couple things that are important to me. One is that I recognize that I actually get a lot of joy out of the work that I do with community. If I get to be in community with people that care about the state of our planet and the people that live on it, I'm a pretty happy camper. And so I look for ways to structure my work that I get to be in community. And if I do that, then I feel that's a huge win in and of itself.
Yeah.
And beyond that, the second item is that I do prioritize the time for myself that I didn't used to. So I will go and do some writing, I draw, I hike, like I take that time for myself, and I recognize that it's a part of investing in the movement and the causes that I believe in. And if you aren't doing both of those things, certainly if I'm not doing both of those things, then I feel very unbalanced. But that's how I've managed to kind of square the circle of, I do work a lot. It's a big part of my life. I'm not just a 9-to-5 person, but because I do it in community and I do prioritize that time for myself in patches here and there, I find that I'm able to live in a much more balanced way.
Totally. And that sounds like, those extra hours when they're spent in community, they make it worth it.
They do. They really do.
For me, it was the point where I became a member organizer with QP for a bit. And, that was my peak radical moment. But that really taught me the importance of, knowing your worth and spending the time in something that has value, but also respecting what is worth fighting for. And because I noticed, I began to get other internships and small gigs, and the working culture wasn't as nice as my very first position, that actually had a very healthy way of working. And then from then on, it was just going down. I was like, is this just going to keep being so variable? But then I noticed that with the more meaning that this jobs had, the least that I would be thinking about that really. So not to say that we don't need to look after our fair compensation and those volunteer hours that link up a lot with the privilege we have. A lot of people can't really do those volunteer hours, particularly people who are more marginalized. And so, especially in the financially precarious Vancouver, where the intersection of so many crises comes, that's really, really challenging. All right, George, I've been, for the past 6 to 7 months, even a bit before that, I freaked out. I was like, oh my God, I'm graduating so soon. And for context, I have a geography degree. I have really cool mentors, people like Naomi Klein, and people that really are sort of in the front of that idea of climate justice and with the media. But I begin to check my resume and I don't know how to sell myself in a way. And I have friends in business or engineering and, all of these different skills. So for me, my only opportunity is to see, okay, maybe I'll look into the nonprofit sector. And then I think, okay, but, nonprofit might be sometimes underfunded, especially for youth in climate. I saw some statistics that was less than 1% in Canada. So, then I am, okay, can I be a consultant? What am I meant to do? It's been really challenging to understand what are the different organizations, job titles, and funders out there that work with climate and sustainability. Have you taken a look at this? And if so, what is your way of understanding the different groups?
Yeah, having a map of the ecosystem is a really helpful tool for anybody looking to start their career, or even, I'm well into my career now, and I think about the landscape of organizations that I work with or are important every day. It's crucial. I like to divide it into different kind of segments, I guess. I think about, if you think of it in kind of like concentric circles, something really core and building outward, there are a number of organizations that are really deeply and profoundly and strategically focused on climate and environment issues. The David Suzuki Foundation, the Pembina Institute, our organization Zero Emissions Innovation Center. There's a cohort of them that are really at the center of the climate agenda, certainly in British Columbia, but in many cases they're actually influencing Canada as well. You got to know those organizations first, I think, because they will be the ones that will be at the hub of so many things. They'll be the center of the wheel. And then as you branch out, you start to get to organizations that are either sort of peripherally focused on climate or environment, or maybe they are a pretty generic organization like, say, a Chamber of Commerce. And because climate and environment issues are so important, they will tend to have a committee or a sub-network or maybe an initiative that focuses on that as well. So I think if you're looking to understand the entirety of the sector, that's a long conversation. There's lots of pieces to it. But if you're trying to navigate it as like a new job seeker, for example, I think it's, first of all, it's just knowing that core of organizations that are really the center of stuff, that are really moving stuff. And then peripheral to them, it's their partners, it's the organizations they work with the most. And in some cases, the organizations they're trying to influence. Could be major government ministries, big private sector players, industry associations. And you can start to map out who the voices in those organizations are that are really pushing things forward, any of the initiatives that they have that are really interesting, again, especially if they're partnered maybe with one of those really core environmental groups. And then the networks and the spaces that they convene. And from the standpoint of finding a job, building your career, getting to know people, it's showing up. It really is the centrality of good networking, is being in the room when stuff happens. And so if you've done your research and you know what those organizations are, and you know them maybe in the kind of sector that you want to play in, so you're an accountant, great. You know what CPA is, there's accountants for sustainability, you're aware of different groups in the financial sector that are doing climate related stuff, for example. You navigate and find those, and then you just keep showing up. Hey, what's going on? Great to meet you. Great to meet you. And you get those networking coffees, those informational interviews, and you can build from that. But I think it's start with the core, build out concentrically from there. And I think a lot of people miss this, but write it down. Mark it out. People will just like kind of have the mental model in their heads, but actually having a sort of visual, digital, whatever map is going to help you do that more and annotate it, add to it over time, build your understanding of what the space is, and you can go really far with that.
Yeah. I remember in the first few opportunities that I was seeking for work, out of interest, I was like, okay, who's funding this? And then, you're rich, and then you're like, okay, it's funded by a fossil fuel company. And you're like, oh my God. But then I just became practice of that and looking at the partners and the websites. And yeah, you mentioned that, like always like, oh, who's Pembina? Who's Tamarack? And, like all of these institutes that, have some sort of programs and together. So yeah, I think that that's something I have found very, very useful. But it's challenging to just go from, website surfing and then LinkedIn search and then coffee chat. Sometimes it's a bit overwhelming. And particularly I feel like in my generation, we're not that social sometimes in terms of actually going forward and looking after mentors and looking after these networks. Because sometimes, because we're so much online already, asking for a coffee chat may be very overwhelming for a lot of people, but it's really so important because my brother tells me all the time this, our generation wants to click on the easy apply LinkedIn button and that's it. And I mean, I did get one job one time like that, but
as someone who's done hiring, I can tell you it's not the fast track. Unfortunately, it will 9 times out of 10, just going in cold like that is, unsurprisingly is not the answer. I think it's important to say that, being in the room, as you say, in this day and age doesn't always mean physically. There are so many webinars that are going on. There's digital meetups, and you can always ask someone for a digital coffee. I do that all the time still in my career. I think that it is important to show up. Like it is important to be in person too, because we're, as much as I love being able to do so many things digitally, flesh and blood really does matter. Yeah. And it is part of how you will build a lasting connection with folks, and how you can do big work together.
Yeah, totally. And I think that from our end, because it can be very, I wouldn't say commodifying, but you do feel like one more resume sometimes. And sometimes an AI will just, branch out and then you're not in the game. So have you began to notice a community aspect with your friends in your field? And just, acquaintances to support each other and be like, oh, who got this job in the end? Or perhaps sending each other jobs, making those connections and being that third party.
I have placed throughout my, probably the past decade and a half, like an incredibly high value on joining the networks. And when we say network, we really mean community, right? Like it's people, whether it's a social media network or something else, but finding those networks where things are happening, and if they're not there, building them. It is amazing to me how easy it is actually to get people together if you have a common call to action or a common problem, a question, to say, hey, hi, I'm not sure. What else is going on here? Or, hey, I'm really concerned or passionate about this thing. What can we do together, right? That kind of community building has been some of the most valuable work that I've ever been able to do. I've been privileged to do that at the global level, the national level, the local level. And certainly here in Vancouver, I make a point of convening my community to talk about those kinds of issues on probably like a monthly basis in different forms, in different ways. And sometimes it's, hey, let's go for a picnic in the park. And sometimes it's, let's have a meeting and talk about this really serious issue. But it's that continual repetition of points of connection and contact and conversation. That's what keeps not just the movement moving, but that's what deepens our impact, our relationships, and I think the value and the fun of the work.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. No, and I think that this comes great as we start to wrap up, but thinking about the movement, and something we mentioned in previous conversation is how there's organizations like Youth Climate Corps in BC or City Hive, and these are organizations that are working with programs that look to empower youth to become more proficient, to build capacity for them, and as they become young professionals and as they begin to create a network. Truthfully, though, you begin to notice some patterns. Me being part of a few programs with them and also understanding the different ecosystem around them, you do see the niche and the echo chamber sometimes. I want to begin to pose a question around what do you think comes after? What is the next step as we try to scale this, what has to be a mass mobilization, where, not everyone who has an environmental degree needs to have it so that they can belong to this movement?
Well, I would say not even is the case that it won't only be environmental degree havers. It can't be, right? People that come from a climate, a nature, an environmental background are going to be really important voices in helping level set and build awareness and understanding of some of these issues. But if I look at our movement 10 years from now, and it's you and I and a couple of people that we know still having these conversations, we have failed. We have failed, right? And we talk about, equity and representation in the environmental movement. That's the journey we're on right now, is recognizing that there hasn't been enough of a focus on that in the past, and we need to move that forward now. I think where we're dancing in some challenging territory is we're trying to right historical wrongs that are tied up in the climate crisis and inequality and colonization, all of these things. And we're working to a deadline. We know that the planet is year over year degrading, whether that's species at risk, whether that's carbon content in the atmosphere, availability of fresh water. You look at the 9 planetary boundaries. We live in a world in crisis, and that's a difficult, heartbreaking reality to inhabit, but we need to always be, I think, clear-eyed about that. And so the growth of the movement is essential. It's absolutely critical that we bring everybody in. And I think there's a couple things that stand up to me in how we're going to do that. One is that we need to think about relatability. We are often, as advocates of these issues, in the position of kind of wagging our fingers at people and saying, don't use that plastic bag, don't drive that car, don't use that thing, don't. And it is true, we are going to have to stop doing a bunch of stuff if we want to live in a more sustainable world. But we are also going to gain a tremendous amount. Cleaner air, cleaner water, the ability to sit in more spaces like this, living closer to the places that we work, being able to use beautiful, sustainable urban transit, knowing that our jobs that we work aren't just destroying the planet, but maybe even making it better. Those benefits, to me, are how we're going to make the work we want to do relatable. And we need to lead with those. And we can't shy away from the crisis that I'm describing. But if our message is don't, be afraid, well, we know where that leads, right? There's lots of people who work that way, and it doesn't take us anywhere good. I think the challenge for folks who are deeply aware of the crisis is to be able to hold the grief that we feel and knowing just how endangered we are, and still identify and speak to and work with those points of optimism that exist wherever they may be. So relationality and building a sense of relatability and building that sense for the movement is of utmost importance. And I think the other one that I would say in terms of a what next is that particularly young people have so much justifiable frustration and sometimes disgust at where our politicians and many of our major institutions have taken us. It's reasonable. And yet those institutions and the democracy that we depend on, we're speaking months before the American election, which is, I think, a very frightening time to be alive in many ways. We need people to believe that democracy is a meaningful and impactful way to shape our society, and that we can keep going back to it. Because if we turn away, particularly as young people, and you can see this in all the major elections right now, you see older elected leaders saying, well, young people don't show up to vote. They're not involved in the party. They're not involved in this. I get that I'm shaping their future, but if they don't show up, then I'm not really going to pay much attention. And people say that with different levels of volume, but it's part of it. And so I think that the next really, really challenging part of our work, and I say this as someone who has all of the frustrations and the sense of betrayal from many, many, many leaders in my time, we need to find ways to stay engaged, to be persistent. We need to really, really honor the value of showing up to do the ugly work of democracy day in and day out. Because if we don't, we'll lose it. And I think that that's a clarion call for any of us who are in this work, and not just environmentalists, people who are interested in a better and more just society generally. We have to stay focused on the institutions that protect us, that are made up of us, like our governments. They're not perfect, but they're the best we got. And if we lose them, well, the whole game is over anyway. And so I don't want that to be a disappointing or a dark note to end on, but I think that if we are mobilized and if we are engaged in those institutions, we can do really big things because we've done it before. But we need to stay focused and targeted on those. And I have optimism that I look at the next generation of elected leaders that are running right now, young people all over the world. There's so much to be optimistic about in those spaces, but it's the persistence and staying engaged that's going to make the difference.
I think if we're able to find the urgency in optimism, then that's one of the key things. Also, breath, net zero. Excellent. I think that leaves lots of people, not only in our networks, but just young people across BC and in Canada that are trying to find this community and are trying to have people to look up to. And after today's conversation, that's something that I live with. I think I look up to you and your network, and I'm really inspired to keep doing this work because, people are out there trying to make it work. So thank you so much for today's chat, George.
My pleasure. Thank you so much.
Right.